If you're coming from a C# Java background, this is how we see a function. A function will have an access modifier, a return type, and parameter or two which we pass. But this function has got no significance unless it is attached to a particular type. Those types could be class, structure, static class, interface, record, anything. But the function has got to be attached with a particular type, right? And in order to invoke that method or function, we need either a class instance or through the class name if it's a static one. But in this chapter, we are not going to talk about C# function, but we're actually going to talk about the function that is backbone of JavaScript. In C#, it's the class who is at master, right? Class is the first class citizen when it comes to C#. But in JavaScript, function becomes the first class citizen. It has got all the thing which we need in order to run a web application. So in this chapter, let's talk about two important things. One is function and one is scope, right? Function is the reusable block in the code, like in C#, that organizes our logic. This is where we write our business logic and everything together. Independently, those variables and all will not do anything, right? In order to organize them and in a structured manner, we want to repeatedly use them. We use function. And the scope is the boundary that controls what is accessible. So let's say you have created a variable. Where exactly you've created is going to decide how accessible that's going to be for a particular block or code. Okay, so let's start understand. Before we move ahead, let's understand what we already have seen in this series. We have seen JavaScript execution environment. We have seen how let and const differ, how the type of those variables is decided at runtime, what is primitive type, reference type, what is type conversion, type coercion also we have seen, what is equality rules and control flow. So moving ahead with this chapter, from next chapter, as I told, will be the advance. Understanding this function and block will be the key. And immediately after this chapter, I will post all the question which can be asked from the module one. So let's consider this to be a module one where whatever we have discussed. So everything around these topic, I will be sharing all the interview questions which are frequently asked. So let's start understanding the functions now. Apart from a reusable code, functions in JavaScript are also values. A function can be stored, passed, and returned, just like any other value. It acts as a literally variable. You can store that value, whatever function is going to return. You can pass the same thing in a different method. You know, you can literally pass a function to another function, and whatever the output that gets, again, that can be passed to a different function. So the structure of the application is, and in order to avoid any confusion, let's understand very clearly. Whenever we are using basically object-oriented programming, the class is the one who decides when to invoke a method or a function. But in JavaScript, it's the browser which calls the JavaScript, and JavaScript is the one which is gonna give all the power to functions, allow all the business logic manipulation and everything, how particular variable will be used, how far that its accessibility gonna be, and everything comes to function. So that's why in JavaScript, function doesn't belong to any class or any type. It is an independent one, and it has got all the capabilities to run or create a smooth web application. Now let's understand the reason why JavaScript behave the way it is. That how, if you imagine, if you've got so many functions, so many different functions, code will look so cluttered, right? When JavaScript came into the picture in 1995, at that time, there was no module, bundles, framework, nothing was there. So the requirement at that time was very different. In the initial chapter, I already told you, without JavaScript, any web page is going to be a static page. It will not do anything. It's just like a dead body. It's JavaScript who puts the soul into it. So click a button without JavaScript, it will not behave anything. So at that time, requirement was interact to allow a web page to get to be interacted with the user. In that context in mind, at that time, the classes and all those interfaces, frameworks and all was not at all were in mind. At that time, user interaction has to be fast. Whatever user is requesting for, even through a button click or any interactable piece of code we write, has got to work super fast. And that's where JavaScript was not at all built for uh, architecture style of creating a very thick web page. It was always about interaction, and that's where these kind of functions which you see, which looks very complicated, and it is not attached to any type, let's say class or something. Without that, it works so fine because the user interactivity was at the peak, was at the center of center of core when JavaScript came to being. So what became the core abstraction? JavaScript was built around function and events and callbacks and runtime. We'll understand each concept one by one in the coming chapter. So currently, hope you are clear that it's the function who will be the master in JavaScript application, in any application. The function can be passed, the function's return value can be stored, and that can be, composed and sent out to different methods, function, return, everything will work because JavaScript is a completely functional centric. Here, class or those types doesn't even exist. Now, in TypeScript, it's a different thing, right? But currently, since we are focusing on JavaScript, let's focus simply on JavaScript. That's one of the biggest reason why JavaScript, became the most popular language when it comes to designing a web application, basically, because it is very lightweight, is dynamic in nature. When it comes to the moment you click, only that method or function has to be called, and whatever want to do with has got to be done. You don't have to call the entire class and invoke a method and so on. It is completely event driven. A event happen, and in response to that, you you respond basically, right? So that's why even the modern frameworks uses JavaScript under the hood. React directly uses it. Angular uses it through TypeScript and others as well, right? Because the JavaScript scales from a button click to a full stack architecture through these frameworks and libraries. Because these frameworks and libraries uses JavaScript in a much more efficient way. You can literally create a web page only through JavaScript, but using these frameworks makes your life much easier. Okay, let's see, how do we structure logic? For that, we need function and scope. Function and its scope collectively make our logic structured. What I mean by that, as I already said, functions are the first class citizen. Function is the one which can be invoked, assign a value, the function can be passed as a reference, and so many things. Everything is allowed. And it makes our interaction with a static page much more faster and efficient under the hood. Okay. So this is the syntax, you can say, of a function. Okay. We don't have to give any access modifier, return type. Return type, anyways, we have discussed enough. That will be decided at runtime, right? So we create a function with whatever name, and this is how we pass the parameter, and it will return this value. So here, since JavaScript sees at runtime that it is a string, that time it will decide this function should return a string. We don't have to mention anything upfront, right? Because JavaScript defines behavior because it is not, you know, in contract with any sort of type, let's say class in Java in C Sharp. We don't have. It is an independent function and it can be used anywhere the way you want them to, right? Now you can assign function to a variable. If you see this function is there and you have literally assigned this function to this, and whatever it's this function is going to return will be stored here. And this stored value can be passed to a different variable as well. All this is possible. But obviously, if you're coming from object-oriented programming, it looks odd. But you will realize the flexibility in the coming chapter when we will be doing a lot of, using this concept. You will see how we implement in Angular as well as in React or anywhere. Okay. And there is a concept called arrow function. It is exactly like functions, with slight deviation. So when we look at arrow function, let's understand a little bit about arrow function. It is exactly the way normal functions are in JavaScript, but it is shorter in syntax. And the core value, core idea, whenever we should be using it, when any function which is going to return a value and that has got to be assigned to a variable, that time we use arrow function a lot. You will see this arrow function usage even in Angular, React, everywhere. You can ignore this for time being because it's an advanced topic. I will come to this when we will be covering the advanced JavaScript. Okay. So, let's say you have a function, right? Function add a and there are two parameter and it returns the summation of that. The same method can be written something like this, right? Const equals to, and these two represents the parameter, and that will return type. It's very much we have some similar syntax in C sharp as well, if I am not wrong, right? So that's how arrow function works. This is exactly that way, but there are slight difference, which is this part, which will come to that, but not in this chapter because it will complicate things and it will give you a very cluttered sort of thing. So you can, as I was talking about, you can see the common use cases of arrow function while handling the API response. We use that in Angular HTTP calls. We use that. We use a lot when we want to transform any value. Here we are given the example of array, but it can be used for others as well. So it is most common whenever we want to write a inline logic, a small logic, or callbacks, or handling the API response. These are the most common usage of array function. Okay, as I already told, you can have a note of this, that when should we use the traditional one and when should we use the arrow function. Now let's talk about what is scope in JavaScript. That's a very interesting thing because this actually decides how those variables which we have defined somewhere is going to be accessible within a function, outside a function, within a block, out of the block, globally, and everything. Let's talk about it in detail because this is going to be very important where you should actually define a variable and how defining a variable at wrong place can mess your code up. Let's talk about it in detail. Scope is nothing but exactly what we have public, private, protected, internal, and so on in C Sharp. Scope is also something which decides how far a variable is going to be accessible. Nothing else. Whenever you're learning a new language, don't, you know, fall into a trap of different vocabulary. It's just the vocabulary difference. And it's JavaScript way of handling variables accessibility. Okay. So scope determines the accessibility of the variable, how far or to which block we want to allow that particular variable to be accessed, right? Nothing else. It has nothing to do with the memory allocation, nothing. It has just to do with the accessibility of that particular variable. Okay. And we've got three types of variable like we have in C sharp as well, right? Public, private, internal, and so on. So block scope, function scope, global scope. What these are, let's see. So whenever we have defined a variable inside the curly braces, that becomes variable belonging to that block. This curly braces represents block, piece of block, and whatever variables and things are defined out there goes inside that particular block. So this curly braces out here becomes a block, and no matter how many variables we are defining, those variable will belong to inside this block, and accessibility of those variables will be only inside this. So if let's say you come inside this if block and you see name is out here, but the moment you try to log the value inside a console, you will see reference areas because this name will not be able to reference this. As I said, let and const are block scope, and whatever variable we have declared inside this block will remain inside this block. Okay. No, every function creates a boundary, every function. So this function has its own block. Okay, this is called functional block. This is also like a block, right? So inside this, even if let's say you have multiple variables, multiple blocks, everything will be accessible within this two curly braces, which is defining the scope of this variable. Everything inside is functional scope. So every variable you can access within this function. But the moment you try to log it outside, it will again give you a reference variable because this is inside this block of the function, right? Now there is something called global variable. Now let's say if you have defined a variable outside of function and every block. Now, if you try to access this within this function, you will be able to do that because it is global. It is accessible within any block, whether it's a functional block or a normal block. Everywhere it will be accessible. It's exactly like what we have in C sharp public keyword. It is accessible throughout the script. I hope the difference between global, functional, and block scope is clear. Right? Just give an example to see all different kind of scopes. Since it is defined globally, it will come under this particular piece of code will come under global scope. And inside function, no matter how many blocks are there, whatever defined inside this function will be accessible to each other to this point. But the moment you be try to log something outside of this functional block, it will give you reference error. And at the end, we have block scope, which has boundary of particular block. You see, inside if statement, we have defined a variable, block variable. It is accessible throughout this block. But the moment we have tried to log it outside of this block, what is coming? Reference error. So accessibility depends on where exactly your variables are defined. If it is defined inside a block, then it will be accessible through only within the block. And if it is in, let's understand the accessibility of different variables in a bit, in a slightly different way. There's something called lexical accessibility. I don't want to get into it yet because since it's a beginner-friendly course, I don't want to confuse you with a lot of things. But just for simplicity, let's understand all the inner functions or the inner blocks will have accessibility to its outside scope. Okay, so just look at this example of function. There's a function outer, and it has got a variable outer var. And there's another function inside outer function, which is called inner, and trying to access these two variables. Since it's a global variable, it will be accessible anyways everywhere. Since this outer var is part of this, and we are trying to log it within this inner function, it will have the accessibility of this because it is in the outer boundary of it. So every inner function has got the accessibility of outer variables. Okay, where the function is defined, you have to check that. Here it is an outer function, and within that outer function, we've got an inner function, and they will be able to access those variable which is defined in the outer function because of the lexicity, which we will talk about in greater detail in coming up chapters. Not now, because that will complicate things. So why do we even need scope? Exactly like the way we need in C sharp, we want to manage the accessibility of a particular variable so that if let's say everything is public, everybody can go and change it, and that will mess up our code. So because of that, this lit and const came in 2016. Prior to that, 2015, I guess, yeah. So prior to that, we used to have var, which was, which literally used to allow so much pollution, and to stop it, it used to take some effort. So that's where these scopes came into the picture. Simply again, to revisit, if we look at the current scope where whenever we want to find a variable, first thing is to look into the where that block is. First, it will look into the inner circle of it. Then, if not found, then it goes one step beyond that, and then till by using this step, it will go till the global variable. Okay, so if you want to find a variable and its accessibility in this block, it will try to find something within this block. If not, then it will go to functional scope. If not, it will go there. If nowhere, then obviously it will give you a reference error. So inner rooms can be C outer scope. So if this block is out here, it has the accessibility of every variable, everything defined in this functional scope as well as in the global scope. Inner variable will hide the outer variable. So in this context, in this part, Batman will be printed, not the Superman. You try running this application and you'll get to know. So that's all what I had to discuss about function and scope. From next chapter, we are going to work on advanced topic, advanced JavaScript. And before that, you'll get a video where I will be giving you all the questions which can be asked to now, whatever we have learned till now, till this chapter. Let's meet in the next chapter and keep liking and sharing with your friends, whoever want to learn JavaScript or UI, being a .NET backend developer. Let's meet you in the next video. Thank you very much.